Hello everybody, welcome to another edition of the Michael Costa Show. Today's video is going to be a continuation of my last show where I talked about children being given cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers without parental consent. Well, in today's video, I'm going to go a bit further of how right now it is getting even worse, with a story about a father in British Columbia, if I'm not mistaken, fighting for his daughter. But first, I'd like to read you one family story in particular that I found in this book, The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race, and Identity by Douglas Murray. One of the most public intellectuals, if you will, of our time, that usually talks about these issues that are important in our society. So let me read you this one family story. This is the experience of just one American parent whose family has had to navigate the trans journey in recent years. To protect the identity of the child, I will be deliberately vague about locations and some specifics. But the family were living in one of the big cities of America and have only fairly recently moved to a more rural location. This is where they are when I speak with the child's mother, who I will call Sarah. Sarah is in every way an average middle-class mom. She cares for her children and, like her husband, works to support them. She describes her politics as slightly left of center. 4 years ago, at the age of 13, her daughter announced that she was trans and that she was actually a boy. The daughter had already been diagnosed with a mild form of autism and had trouble being accepted by some of her peers. She had trouble picking up conversational signals. Invitations to play weren't reciprocated, and her fashion choices weren't deemed quite right by all of her peers. In time, Sarah's daughter found that boys in her school were slightly more amenable to her than girls. But even then, she couldn't quite get the degree of social acceptance which she wanted. "Why doesn't anyone like me?" she asked. She used to intermittently ask her mother that same question. Trying to make sense of why she was not fitting in with the girls in particular, she was also trying to work out why she wasn't fitting in with her peers in general. Then, one day, she announced to her mother that she was in fact a boy, and that this was the cause of her problems. Sarah asked her what had given her the idea that she was trans. After all, for her family, it had only seemed to come on very suddenly. Her daughter said that she had got the idea after a presentation at her school. This is happening a lot. After kids are shown propaganda and are being indoctrinated in elementary schools and in junior high schools, the peer pressure after comes, and we all know as young teenagers, we always question who we are, what we're going to do in life. It's a period where most people question their identities. And I'm not saying their sexual or gender identity. I'm saying their identity in general, who they are. So these videos are already causing her to ask herself if all these problems are because of this. At this point, it emerged that around 5% of the children at her daughter's school now identified as transgender after watching the video. They included a remarkably similar range of children, including children who had been diagnosed as having forms of autism and a history of being unpopular or poor at connecting with their peers. So now they're using kids with difficulties like autism and pushing these dangerous ideas onto them. Of course, her mother wanted to know more. If there had been any other children at her school who identified as trans, would she have decided that she was a boy? Sarah's daughter said that no, she wouldn't have done so because she wouldn't have known that it was an option. It was not that she thought she was a boy, but that she was a boy. And what is more, her mother would not be able to understand this because she was a cis. So you see now the indoctrination comes into play, using these words that she probably had never heard ever before watching that propaganda video in her class. Sarah had never heard the word cis before, let alone being described as it. Sarah's daughter repeatedly told her mother that trans children know who they are. But Sarah was supportive. She agreed to call her daughter by her new preferred male name and began to address her using male pronouns. She even introduced her daughter to her friends as her son. Trying to be as supportive as possible, mother and daughter even went on a trans pride march together and danced along to Lady Gaga's Born This Way. Sarah was so supportive that she bought the first binder her daughter needed to conceal her developing breasts. It is hard to see what more a mother could have done. At the same time, quite understandably, Sarah started to read up online about the whole trans business. It was new to her family's life, and she wanted to get a range of views in order to arrive at some understanding of her own. By Sarah's own admission, her first impressions of the online debate were not good. A lot of the critical reading online was, she thought, marked by a strain of anti-LGBT sentiment. The people who wrote about it often seemed to be what she described as bigoted or religious. She had never explored any of this deeply before. She was just concerned about my daughter. And so, Sarah went to speak to some professionals, starting with some gender clinicians. The first of these told her something which echoes what many other people in her position have heard. The clinician told her that parental acceptance was the first step to prevent suicide. As with any parent, this was a threat of the worst nightmare imaginable. Excuse me. The doctor clinician also told Sarah that since her daughter had been insistent, persistent, and consistent in her claims, this meant that her daughter was indeed a boy. So basically, the daughter self-diagnosed herself, and the doctor, instead of doing doctor's job, which is to evaluate the situation and then come to a conclusion, to a diagnosis at the end, he starts with the conclusion. Because the kid self-diagnosed herself as having gender dysphoria, then that means automatically she has gender dysphoria, and let's give her the medication. The first of these told her something which echoes what many other people in her position have heard. The clinician told her that parental acceptance was the first step to prevent suicide. As with any parent, this was a threat of the worst nightmare imaginable. The doctor clinician also told Sarah that since her daughter had been insistent, persistent, and consistent in her claims, this meant her daughter was indeed a boy. Sarah was not only worried by the words of the professionals, but also by some of what her daughter was saying. Whenever Sarah's daughter described her feelings of gender dysphoria, her mother noticed that the words seemed rather scripted, meaning she had learned them somewhere else. And to say that the script was manipulative is an understatement. At one stage, her daughter issued a list of demands which included blackmail and threats unless these demands were met. Something usual a teenager questioning herself will do. Sarah's daughter was 13 and a half when she announced that she was trans. At 14 and a half, she went to the therapist, and at 15 was told that she should start taking the puberty blocker, Lupron. At each stage, it was stressed that it was insulting for the mother to question the feelings of her daughter, and that as with trans people, so with autistic people know who they are, she was reassured. Even to question this was to be ableist. A number of different therapists were approached, and eventually, mother and child returned to the first one. When Sarah expressed some concerns over the choices being offered to her daughter by the profession, and specifically the idea of her daughter going on puberty blockers, she was told, you have a choice between puberty blockers and the hospital. So basically intimidating the parent into accepting the puberty blockers. And so at 17 and a half, Sarah's daughter announced that she wanted to transition. Of course, Sarah asked her daughter about whether she really wanted to do this. She stressed the irreversibility of the path down which her daughter was going. Even more irreversible than the hormones was the irreversibility of transitioning. What if, Sarah asked her daughter, after choosing to transition, she then felt she needed to detransition? What if, having made this change, she decided she didn't want it? Her daughter's response was, "So I'll kill myself." While no parent should ever take such a threat lightly, there does seem to be a pattern to it. As Germaine Greer had claimed much earlier, and not only from the young people, but from some of the medical professionals who are pushing their case. So, now we see the story of one family in particular, where after watching an autistic child, after watching propaganda videos in school, in her class, and with the peers and with her peers also questioning their trans identity, decides that she is a boy. She is no longer a girl. And doctors don't do the doctor's job and start by evaluating the symptoms and then coming to a diagnosis, to a conclusion. They start from the back and they start from a conclusion, and right away, you got to give medication to the child. And where in some cases, in some jurisdictions, you don't need parental permission to go on these medications. And even more in some even more extreme jurisdictions, you don't even have to have parental permission to go through the sex change surgery. Okay, so now let me read you the story of another man. Father jailed after referring to biological female child as his daughter. The warrant was issued by a judge for the arrest of the father after calling his biological female child his daughter and referring to her with the pronouns she and her. He was found to be in contempt of court. There's a man in Canada who can only be alluded to as he who shall not be named. The father to a child who is undergoing gender transition. For the sake of natural justice, it is important to speak this man's name. He is now the Canadian state's prisoner of conscience. This is big. The warrant was issued by a judge for the arrest of a father after calling his biological female child his daughter and referring to her with the pronouns she and her. The father was found to be in contempt of court. The father is a father to a gender non-conforming biological female 16-year-old who identifies as transgender and prefers the use of male pronouns. The father has repeatedly called this person his daughter, though the court has forbade it. The transition has been underway for more than 2 years. On Tuesday at 10 a.m. Vancouver time, the father surrendered himself to the court in response to the Attorney General of British Columbia's warrant, his arrest for contempt. He was then arrested and jailed. The warrant was issued by Judge Taman on March 4, 2021. The father opposes his child's undergoing gender affirmative medical procedures and has stated this opposition again and again in the hope of saving his child from irreversible harm. The Canadian medical system, the legal system, and the child's mother press ahead with social and medical transition of the child. A summary of the gag order. 1. AB, a 14-year-old transgender boy, applies for a protection order to restrain his father, CD, from publishing, speaking, or giving interviews about this case or about AB's personal and medical information. A, CD shall be restrained from I, attempting to persuade AB to abandon treatment for gender dysphoria, II, addressing AB by his birth name, and III, referring to AB as a girl or with female pronouns, whether to AB directly or to third parties. CD shall not directly or indirectly, through an agent or third party, publish or share information or documentation relating to AB's sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, mental or physical health, medical status, or therapies. On December 14, 2020, the father was compelled by Justice Mazzari's court to collude in the gender transitioning of his 14-year-old daughter and told not to call his biological female child his daughter. In response, Hoagland made a charter challenge engaging his right to freedom of speech. When he appeared in family court, the judge forced him to sit in the prisoner's dock, said the father's lawyer, Carrie Lind, even though he was guilty of no crime. The judge referred to him as the accused. Lind made an application for the judge to recuse himself on the basis that all of this was prejudicial. The father released additional details about his child's behavior that the court disallowed. The father discovered that the school had been showing his daughter Soji 123, the going sexual and gender identity education materials in British Columbia, which amounts to transgender identity propaganda videos. So the father discovered that the child had been watching through class, through the school. Soji 123, go look it up. The sexual and gender identity education materials. This is in Canada. This is not in the United States or in Europe. This is straight from British Columbia. Okay? In grade 7 yearbook, the child was referred to by a different name. The school counselor changed the child's name without telling her parents. The school socially transitioned the biologically female child on its own initiative with the input of a gender ideologue psychologist, Dr. Wallace Wong. So you see how they work here. First, they show your child propaganda videos, peer pressuring them to want to transition and change sex. Okay? Then, they'll support that narrative when your child does want to change sex by an activist doctor, an ideologue psychologist, if you will. So when the father accompanied his child to a consultation with Wong, the psychologist advised the pubescent child to take testosterone. Wong referred the child to the endocrinology unit at a local hospital. Meanwhile, Hoagland was looking for mental health solutions to help the child without drugs. On the child's first visits to the hospital, a treatment plan was put into action. Both the child and her mother, the man's ex-wife, signed a consent form which explicitly stated that the treatment was experimental, meaning that the endocrinologists recommending the treatment didn't know the long-term health impact. Do you understand that this doctor prescribed experimental drugs to a child that they didn't know the long-term effects of this drug? That even the mother and the child itself had to sign a consent form to be able to take these drugs. And you don't see anything wrong with this? A gender identity activist lawyer, Barbara Findley, represented the child in court. So another activist. Justice Bowden decided that the child's best interest lay in destroying her long-term health to make her body appear more like that of a male. The father, in contrast, thinks his daughter's best interest lie in preserving his child's health, in case his child ends up among the estimated 85% of children who desist in their belief that they're the opposite sex once puberty ends. 85%. Come on. 85% of the children who desist in their belief that they're the opposite sex once puberty ends. So if 85% of these children later on in life decide that they had made a mistake, well, in some cases it's irreversible, and the long-term damage is done already by that time. So this father, all he wanted to do was protect his daughter from long-term effects of these drugs. He said, "Here I am, sitting there as a parent, watching a perfectly healthy child be destroyed, and there's nothing I can do but sit on the sideline," according to Justin Bowden at the time. "I can only affirm or get thrown in jail," he says. Bowden's court held that the father's consent was irrelevant. The judge went on a step further, declaring that the girl's parents must affirm their child's gender identity and refer to the child as though the fact of her being a gender non-conforming biological female who identifies as transgender means that the child is a boy. If he did not, the parents would be implicated of the criminal offense of family violence. So if the parents don't agree with the child's self-diagnosis, they will call Child Protective Services on them, or even worse, jail them. After the hearing, the father gave an interview to the Federalist saying that people cannot change sex and that mega doses of exogenous testosterone would damage his vulnerable biological female child's health. Justice Mazzari then summarily convicted the father of family violence on the basis that he had to decline to use the child's preferred masculine pronouns. Mazzari authorized a warrant for the father's arrest in the event that he ever used the correct sex pronouns to refer to his daughter again. In the Mazzari ruling, it said that I can only think thoughts which are contrary to the Bowden ruling. The court was gracious enough that they did not police my thoughts, but everything else they could, he said. In 2019, the father abided by the court order, hoping to get his daughter off testosterone. However, in January 2020, the highest court in British Columbia declared that the child should continue to take testosterone. It also imposed a conduct order on Hoagland that he must continue to refer to his biological female child by male pronouns. So the court declared that the child should continue to take testosterone. So who raises our children? Us or the state? That's a core value of Western civilization, is that the parents are responsible for the children and they're responsible to raise those children, not the state. The state has no business telling me how to raise my children, or that the court has no business in ordering a child to take testosterone. The father said that they've created a delusion and they're forcing parents to live in this delusion. What happens when the bubble explodes and the delusion ends? She can never go back to being a girl in a healthy body she should have had. These kids don't understand. What kind of 13-year-old is thinking about having a family and kids? He said, lamenting his child's stolen future. He's 100% right on this statement right there. The father gave interviews to several Canadian commentators. The broadcasts were suppressed by digital platforms, and he was threatened with contempt of court proceedings. What kind of father would I be if in 10 years time she's detransitioning and she asks me, why wouldn't you do anything to stop this? None of you struck your neck out for me back then, he said. The case continues, as does his child's medical transition. Before surrendering to the court, the father felt compelled to visit his childhood homes and shared some of his thoughts with this writer. So I don't need to read this. This is him about reminiscing of his childhood. The Canadian state has taken a drastically wrong turning by institutionalizing transsexual medical procedures for children, then imposing draconian constraints on free expression to conceal the full horror of what it is doing to a generation of children. It seems unwilling to consider the implications of the decision in Kiara Bell versus Tavistock in the UK. In December, the High Court handed down the decision in Kiara Bell's judicial review of the state's gender identity clinic, the Tavistock. It held that children of 16 and under were incapable of giving informed consent to puberty blockers. Thank God a court in the UK made the right decision. In the judicial review hearing, the court asked the Tavistock why it had no long-term data on the outcomes for the children to whom they gave puberty blockers. It responded that it had a 2011 study, but it was unpublished pending peer review. The Tavistock then published the data the day after the High Court handed down the judgment, and not in a peer-reviewed journal. How about that? The day after the court handed down its judgment, they released the study. Here's what the study said. The data confirmed that between 2011 and 2020, a rapidly increasing and disproportionate number of girls were referred to the gender clinic with a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. The clinic had known for 9 years that puberty blockers were both ineffective for psychological distress and harmful to physical health. It chose to keep that information from patients, public, and apparently from the court itself. I wonder why. The court heard evidence that the Tavistock Clinic gave children materials which said, as far as we are aware, the blockers will not harm your physical or mental development. They lied. They lied to give these drugs to the children. The Tavistock study into puberty blockers confirmed that the allegations of Kiara Bell and Mrs. A were well founded. The study showed that of the 44 children given puberty blockers, only 1 did not progress to wrong sex hormones. The Tavistock has claimed that the 2 treatments are not linked and that taking blockers does not inevitably place children on the medical pathway to wrong sex hormones and surgery. That claim has been disproven. They keep on lying to their patients. Blockers are primers for surgery with lifelong health impacts, not simply a benign pause button. They cause long-term damage. Long-term damage to your children. The study also found that medical experiments with puberty blockers did not improve the child's mental health. In fact, the children on puberty blockers felt worse on taking them. So, not only do they cause health problems, but they're ineffective in making your children feel better. In fact, the children on puberty blockers felt worse after taking them. Preliminary findings which showed that after a year on blockers, there was a significant increase in those answering the statement, "I deliberately tried to hurt or kill myself." So after a year on blockers, these children are effectively trying to hurt or kill themselves. This is no joke, guys. This is not just you take the puberty blockers and you press a pause on puberty. And if ever you decide that that's not the way you want it to go, you just stop taking them and puberty starts back. That's a lie. And it should be a criminal lie because it hurts the futures of our children. The children given blockers also lost critical bone density and height, which they can never recover, leaving them vulnerable to osteoporosis and broken bones. The study was 9 years late, in which time thousands of children were primed for gender affirmation surgeries and lumbered with iatrogenic osteoporosis and stunt growth. It remains to be seen whether the court pursues the matter of the Tavistock's suppression of vital data, which could have spread all of those vulnerable children the lifelong effects of puberty blockers. All of this begs the question of why Justin Trudeau and Minister David Lametti continue to push Bill C-16, knowing full well where it leads, destroying the health of vulnerable children for the sake of a delusion. Kiara Bell's case is international news and shows anyone who cares to listen what awaits the victims of the trans healthcare industry. Bell described the Tavistock as having a complacent and dangerous culture, which caused her irreversible harm. Its activities have effectively been shut down by the court ruling. The father's child may not have the same experience as Kiara Bell, who now in her early 20s regrets that she may be unable to become a mother. That's another thing that these cross-sex hormones and puberty blockers cause. Sterility. They cause you to become sterile. She hopes that it will no longer be standard practice for gender clinics to withhold from girls that treatment means they may never be mothers. Imagine for a second your daughter as a teenager, by watching propaganda videos in school and by peer pressure of her peers, decides she wants to transition, starts taking puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and then maybe even sex change surgery. And then later on in her adult life, decides that it was a huge mistake. And now not only has she had irreversible surgery, but now she has bone density problem, osteoporosis, and may never be a mother ever. Imagine how painful that must be for a young woman to have to deal with that. However, with a 4 in 5 chance of desisting and incontrovertible evidence that gender-affirming medical experiments harm the body and fail to help mental well-being, what reasonable adult could now argue that she should stay on that path? We watched this case develop with interest and hope that his arrest and imprisonment may precipitate a watershed moment in drawing national attention to the atrocity of pediatric transitioning. Folks, these are the dangers of having children self-diagnosing and schools changing their names and their pronouns without advising the parents. A father fighting for his daughter to not have to take irreversible drugs that will cause long-term health effects, to the daughter being jailed for simply fighting for his daughter. Is this the world you want to live in? Is this the world you want to raise your daughters and your children? It's not the world I want to raise my children in if I have children one day. We must stand up and fight for our children. It's very important. Their futures are on the line. Depend on us to fight for them. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Michael Costa Show. Hope to see you soon. Peace out.